Well, traditionally, the body of truth the Scripture teaches about man's inherent condition, the condition into which he's born, has been called total depravity. And there's nothing wrong with that term, but I think it can be easily misunderstood. It can come to imply that every person is as bad as they possibly could be, which of course isn't true. And so there's been a sort of drift to say, how can we be clearer about what really this theological issue is we're talking about? And that has brought us, many use the term now, radical depravity. Because it's not that it's total in the sense that you are absolutely as bad as you possibly could be, or that I am, but rather that it's radical. It touches every aspect of life and who I am as a person. So now let's back up and talk about how this comes about. It comes about through original sin. Essentially, the Scriptures teach that because of the sin of Adam, we all are born with the results of that sin in two ways. One of those is there is real personal guilt. I am guilty because Adam was my representative. He represented me in the garden. He did what I would have done given the same circumstance. And therefore I get the guilt for his sin. At the same time, there's the issue of moral pollution. Through my parents and through natural generation, we all receive at conception, and of course it's manifested after birth in clear and incontrovertible ways, we all receive this moral pollution that corrupts us radically. That's the idea. It touches every part of us, from our thinking to our emotions to our will to our words, our attitudes, our actions. It permeates. And of course, the sort of classic description of what radical depravity looks like comes in Romans chapter 3. In verse 9, Paul begins and talks about, in sort of summary form, what that is, that there's no one who measures up. There's none righteous. And then he begins to lay that out by pulling together a number of Old Testament texts to illustrate the nature of just how radical this depravity is. It affects everything. It affects our behavior, it affects our attitudes, it affects our relationships, it affects our speech. And he beautifully and powerfully lays out the nature of that radical depravity. And then he comes in the end to the conclusion. The ultimate reason for it in verse 18 is because there is no fear of God in man's heart. And therefore he manifests all of this, which is part of his nature, but now he manifests it as he lives. And then you come to verses 19 and 20, and Paul wraps up his entire indictment of the first three chapters by saying, look, there's no one who's going to be justified by their own actions. Just look at who we are. Look at the radical depravity that marks us all. So it factors into the gospel absolutely essentially, because if in fact we're not radically depraved, if we're not affected in every part by sin, then perhaps we don't need saving at all, which would be the view some would take. Or if we're only partially affected by this sin, then maybe we can contribute to our salvation. And so it is absolutely crucial to understand that left to ourselves, we are radically depraved, and that affects everything, especially our relationship and capacity to interact with God. I mean, later in Romans, Paul says that the man who's unredeemed is not able to keep God's law. He doesn't want to, but he's not even able to do so. And so it's impossible in light of that for us to do anything to save ourselves. And so instead of the picture that sort of partial sin or partial depravity might give, that I'm able to contribute to my own salvation, just throw me the life preserver and I'll grab it and pull me in. Radical depravity says, no, I'm dead floating on the surface of the water, and I don't even know I'm dead. I have no concept of what my real relationship to my Creator is, and I'm not trying to help myself. I'm not able to grab a life preserver. I have to be rescued entirely. And so radical depravity requires radical divine salvation, whereas something less than that either requires no salvation or it requires salvation that, well, I can contribute something. And we're so tempted to that. I love, Spurgeon's comment that most people have some conception that they can't entirely save themselves. But given that, they'd still like to have a small part in the last mile. That's how we're tempted to think. And radical depravity says, no, your heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Your best acts, your righteousness is filthy rags before God. And so there's nothing you can do except throw yourself on the mercy of God. And that's where radical depravity brings us. It brings us to the first beatitude. Blessed are the beggars in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So we've got to be brought to where we recognize we have nothing. We have nothing to contribute to our salvation or to God's acceptance of us. We're just beggars, throwing ourselves on the divine mercy.